Hey everyone, and welcome back to Study Hall. I'm so excited for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to be tackling a topic that's super relevant and I think really fascinating. We're going to be exploring the history of non-binary gender recognition,
Yeah.
like across different cultures. And what's so cool about this is that it kind of challenges that common misconception that non-binary identities are, like a new thing, like a modern
Yeah.
Western phenomenon.
Right.
When in reality, it's been a part of human societies for centuries.
Absolutely.
So if you're the kind of person who loves to learn something new, loves to, dig into history and challenge your assumptions, well, then you are definitely in the right place.
You're going to love this one.
Buckle up.
So to really get into this, we need to start by kind of deconstructing how we typically think about gender.
Right.
Like in Western thought especially, we often frame gender as this very strict binary. You're either male or female.
Right, like two boxes and that's it.
Exactly. And this way of seeing the world, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's heavily influenced by things like the Enlightenment and Judeo-Christian traditions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like during the Enlightenment, there was this big emphasis on reason and categorization, right?
Totally.
Like trying to understand the world through science and logic.
Mm-hmm.
And that extended to gender, too. Like people were trying to fit everything into these neat little boxes.
Exactly. And that's where that binary thinking really solidified.
Okay, so that's the Western perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when we look beyond that? Like, what do other cultures tell us about gender?
That's where things get really interesting. You see, when we step outside that Western lens, we find a completely different picture. Many cultures throughout history have recognized and even celebrated gender diversity.
Really?
And it's not just about tolerance or acceptance, it's about recognizing the value and importance of individuals who exist beyond the binary.
So it's like these cultures had a more expansive understanding of gender.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm already intrigued. Give me an example. Like, what's a specific culture that had this more nuanced view of gender?
Let's start with Indigenous North American cultures.
Okay.
And the concept of two-spirit people. Now, the term itself might be relatively recent,
Right.
but the identities it encompasses have deep roots going back centuries.
Okay.
These are individuals who embody a blend of both masculine and feminine qualities, and their roles within their communities were incredibly diverse and significant.
Okay, I'm looking at some of the research here, and it mentions the Lakota Winkte.
Yes.
They were assigned male at birth, but took on female roles and were often revered for their spiritual insights.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. It like totally flips the script on what we've been taught about gender roles in Native American cultures.
It does. It challenges those stereotypes we often have. And there are so many more examples. The Navajo, Nadehi, and Dilba, for instance, demonstrate that their understanding of gender was inherently fluid.
Wow. And so were these two-spirit individuals like accepted and integrated into their communities?
No, absolutely. They were often seen as holding a special place in society, sometimes even as spiritual leaders or healers, for example. The Ojibwe Nijmanaduwag held positions of authority entrusted with sacred knowledge and participating in community decision-making.
Wow. So their gender identity wasn't a barrier to leadership or respect?
Not at all. In fact, it was often seen as a source of their wisdom and power.
Okay, I'm also seeing a Zuni Lamana named Wiwa, who even traveled to Washington, D.C. in the late 19th century.
Yes, Weedawaya's story is incredible. They navigated a world so deeply steeped in the gender binary, and yet they were recognized for their intelligence and diplomacy.
That's amazing.
It's a powerful reminder that non-binary recognition is not a new phenomenon.
Okay, so if these identities were so integral to their cultures, why don't we hear more about them? What happened?
Well, the arrival of European colonizers brought a wave of cultural disruption.
Right.
Christian missionaries in particular were intent on imposing their own beliefs and values, and they saw indigenous gender systems as a threat.
So basically, they tried to erase these identities.
In essence, yes.
And the research is pretty clear about the devastating impact of those efforts.
It was a systematic attempt to dismantle. Indigenous cultures and boarding schools played a particularly tragic role.
Yeah, the source material talks about how children were forcibly removed from their families, punished for expressing their true selves.
That's a dark chapter in
A
history,
really dark chapter.
and one that needs to be understood to fully appreciate the ongoing struggle for recognition.
So it wasn't just about religion. It was about power and control.
Exactly.
Like by dismantling these indigenous gender systems, colonizers could assert their dominance.
Precisely, they wanted to control every aspect of indigenous life, including their understanding of gender.
So it was as much a social and political move as it was a religious one.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't end there, right? Like there's a resurgence happening.
That's right. The story doesn't end with colonization today. There's an incredible revitalization effort happening within many indigenous communities.
That's good to hear.
We're seeing events like the Two-Spirit Powwow and the rise of organizations like the Two-Spirit Journal.
So they're reclaiming their heritage.
It's a powerful testament to cultural survival and a reminder that these identities are resilient.
That's really encouraging. Okay, so we've got North America. What about other parts of the world? Like where else can we find examples of this long-standing recognition of non-binary gender?
Let's shift our focus across the globe to South Asia,
Okay.
where we find another compelling example, the Hijra community.
The Hijra community.
Yes, their history stretches back centuries with references even in ancient Hindu texts.
Wait, so even ancient Hindu texts acknowledge people outside the gender binary?
They do. It challenges that assumption that all religions are inherently rigid when it comes to gender.
That's wild. I always associated religion with very traditional gender roles.
It's a common misconception.
So tell me more about the Hijra community. Like, what was their role in society?
Well, during the Mughal era, which spanned from the 16th to the 19th centuries, Hijras even held respected positions in royal courts. They served as advisors, confidants, and even held official roles within the Mughal administration.
Wow, so they were integrated into the power structure.
Exactly. Their gender identity wasn't a barrier to holding positions of influence.
That's pretty incredible. Imagine a time when non-binary individuals were not just accepted, but actively involved in positions of power.
It's a stark contrast to how they were treated later on during British colonial rule.
Oh, right. I bet the British weren't too keen on gender diversity.
You guessed it, the British, with their Victorian ideals, brought a very different perspective.
More restrictive, I'm assuming.
Much more, the Hijra community, like so many other groups whose identities didn't fit the colonial mold, faced suppression and marginalization.
So just like with the Two-Spirit people, colonialism brought about a period of forced assimilation
Sadly.
and the imposition of Western gender norms.
Precisely. The British labeled Hijras as criminals under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, which led to their persecution and further exclusion from mainstream society.
So they were criminalized for simply being who they were.
It was a brutal and unjust system.
But just like we saw in North America, the Hijra community demonstrated incredible resilience.
They did. They maintained their distinct identity and cultural practices despite facing immense challenges.
What's really interesting is that even though they were ostracized by society at large, they still played a significant role in life cycle ceremonies, like births and weddings.
That's right.
That's almost paradoxical, isn't it?
It is. It highlights the complexities of their social position. They were both marginalized and sought after, feared, and respected.
The source material mentions that their presence at these ceremonies is still believed to bring good fortune and fertility.
Yes. That belief persists even today.
It's a fascinating interplay of tradition, spirituality, and societal perceptions.
It really is, and it's important to note that the Hijra community isn't monolithic.
Right.
There are regional variations and diverse experiences within the broader umbrella.
Like different subgroups within the larger community.
Exactly. For example, in Nepal, we have the Medi, and in Tamil Nadu, the Thirunangai. Each of these groups has its own unique cultural context and history.
So there's a lot of diversity within the Hijra community.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got these centuries-old traditions, but what about the modern era? Like, has there been any progress in terms of legal recognition and rights for the Hijra community?
There has, in a landmark decision in 2014, the Indian Supreme Court officially recognized Hijras as a third gender,
Wow.
granting them fundamental rights and access to education, employment, and healthcare.
That's a huge step forward.
It was a historic victory, a major step towards recognizing the legitimacy of non-binary identities.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But I imagine legal recognition doesn't always translate to social change overnight, does it?
Unfortunately, you're right. While the legal victory was significant, many Hijras still face discrimination, economic hardship, and violence.
So it's still a long way to go.
There is. It's a reminder that the fight for true equality goes beyond legal frameworks. It requires a fundamental shift in societal attitudes and behaviors.
So we've traveled from North America to South Asia, uncovering these rich, complex histories of non-binary gender recognition. And I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg.
You're absolutely right. There's so much more to explore. Next time, we'll dive into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, where we'll encounter even more diverse and fascinating examples of how cultures have embraced gender beyond the binary.
I can't wait. Okay, So we're back and ready to keep exploring the fascinating history of non-binary gender recognition. Last time we saw how deeply ingrained it was in Indigenous North American and South Asian cultures. But our journey's not over yet.
Definitely not. There's so much more ground to cover.
So where are we headed next on our global exploration?
Well, let's set our sights on Southeast Asia and the Pacific.
Okay, those regions are known for their incredible cultural diversity, so I'm guessing we're going to find some really interesting perspectives on gender there.
You're absolutely right. Each culture has its own unique understanding, and it gets pretty fascinating.
All right, I'm all ears. Let's dive in. Where should we start?
Let's begin with the Philippines and the Bakla.
The Bakla.
Yeah, they're individuals assigned male at birth who embrace feminine expressions. And what's really interesting is that historically they often held spiritual roles.
Really? So they were like spiritual leaders?
Exactly. Before the Spanish arrived and brought Catholicism, the Bakla were often Babylon. These were shamans, healers, spiritual leaders, figures who held significant social standing.
Wow. So their gender fluidity wasn't just accepted, it was revered in spiritual contexts.
Precisely. It really challenges our assumptions about how rigid gender roles have always been, right?
It totally does, but I'm guessing that Spanish colonization probably had a pretty big impact on the Bakla, just like it did on the Two-Spirit and Hijra communities we talked about earlier.
You're right on the mark. The arrival of Spanish Catholicism, with its strict emphasis on the gender binary, led to the marginalization of the Bakla.
So they were forced to adapt to a society that no longer valued their traditional roles.
Exactly. And they did adapt. They found new spaces to express themselves, often through the arts, entertainment, and fashion industries.
That makes sense. Like in many cultures throughout history, those marginalized communities often find a voice through creative expression.
Absolutely. It's a way to reclaim their power and celebrate their identity.
So even though they faced oppression, the Bakla still found a way to make their presence known.
Exactly. And their influence on Filipino culture is undeniable. Think about figures like Vice Ganda, a beloved Filipino comedian and TV personality.
Yeah, Vice Ganda is a great example of the Bakla's visibility in contemporary Filipino society.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that visibility doesn't always equate to full acceptance.
Right, like they still face stigma and discrimination.
Unfortunately, yes, the fight for LGBTQ plus rights in the Philippines is ongoing.
It's a reminder that even in cultures where certain identities have a long history, the struggle for equality continues.
It's a constant battle.
Okay, so we've got the Philippines. What about other parts of Southeast Asia?
Let's hop over to Indonesia, where we meet the Waria.
The Waria. Okay, tell me about them.
Like the Bakla, they embody both feminine and masculine traits, but their history is really interesting because it's connected to the Bugis people of Sulawesi.
The Bugis people.
Yeah, and they have a really unique gender system. They recognize 5 genders.
5 genders. Whoa, that's something I've never heard of.
It's pretty amazing, right? You've got men, women, then kala, who are assigned female at birth but live as men, and kalabay, who are assigned male at birth but live as women.
Wow, that's so different from the binary thinking we're used to.
And then there's the bisu.
The Bisu.
Yeah, they're considered to embody both masculine and feminine energies and hold a sacred priestly role in Bugis society.
So they're like spiritual leaders.
Exactly. The Bugis people don't see gender fluidity as a deviation. They see it as a pathway to a higher spiritual understanding.
That's such a beautiful way to look at it. It's like they're embracing the full spectrum of human expression.
Absolutely. But as we've seen in other regions, the introduction of new religions often brought about more conservative attitudes towards gender, and Indonesia is no exception.
So the arrival of Islam brought some challenges for the Waria.
Unfortunately, yes. While Islam has enriched Indonesian culture, it's also led to a rise in conservatism. And as a result, the Waria face increasing discrimination in modern Indonesian society.
So even though they have this long history and this incredible gender system, they're still fighting for acceptance.
Exactly. It's not just about social acceptance either. It's about basic rights and safety.
Like what kind of challenges are they facing?
While many Warias struggle with employment discrimination, limited access to healthcare, and even violence.
That's awful.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that even in places where diverse gender identities have been recognized for centuries, there's still a lot of work to be done.
The fight for equality is far from over.
Okay, we've covered the Philippines and Indonesia. Where to next on our Southeast Asia and Pacific tour?
Let's head out to the Pacific Islands, specifically Samoa.
Samoa? Okay, I'm intrigued.
This is where we meet the Fulfafine, and their story offers a really interesting contrast to what we've seen so far. Well, unlike the Bakla and the Waria, the Fa'afafine experience a relatively high level of acceptance within Samoan society.
Really? So they're not facing the same level of discrimination?
Not to the same extent. The term fafafine actually translates to in the manner of a woman. And from a young age, they're often raised in a way that aligns with that expression.
So they're integrated into family and community life.
Exactly. They take on important caregiving roles and participate fully in cultural traditions.
That's amazing. It sounds like the Fafafine offer a glimpse into a society where gender fluidity isn't seen as a threat, but as a natural part of human diversity.
That's a great way to put it. Of course, even in Samoa, there are challenges. Western religious influences, particularly conservative Christian beliefs, have introduced some negative attitudes.
So it's not a perfect utopia.
No, but overall, it's a heartening example of how a culture can embrace and celebrate gender diversity.
It's definitely a breath of fresh air after the stories of suppression and marginalization we've been discussing. It's like a beacon of hope.
It is. It shows that a different way of relating to gender is possible.
Okay, so far we've explored regions where non-binary identities have a long and visible history. But what about areas where contemporary narratives tend to focus on really strict gender roles? Like, what about the Middle East?
That's a great question, and you're right. It's easy to assume that gender diversity is absent from those cultures, but if we dig a little deeper, we'll find a much more nuanced and fascinating picture.
Okay, I'm ready to have my assumptions challenged again. Where do we start?
Let's travel back in time to early Islamic societies, specifically during the 7th and 8th centuries.
Okay.
This is where we encounter the Mukhan-nathun.
The Mukhan-nathun. I've never heard of them.
They were individuals assigned male at birth who exhibited feminine traits, and they played diverse roles in society from entertainment to courtly life.
Really? So they were integrated into different aspects of society.
Exactly. Imagine a time when a celebrated singer in Medina, like the Mukhan-nathun named Tuwais, was not only accepted but renowned for their artistry.
Wow, that really challenges our modern perception of the Middle East as inherently intolerant of gender variance.
It does. It shows that history is often more complex than we realize.
But I have a feeling this period of relative acceptance didn't last.
You're right. As we've seen in other parts of the world, societal attitudes toward gender are rarely static. They're constantly being shaped by various forces, including religion and politics.
So what happened to the Mukhan-nathun? What led to their decline?
Well, over time, there was a gradual shift towards stricter interpretations of Islamic law, which led to greater restrictions on the Mukhan-nathun.
So their freedom and acceptance were gradually eroded?
Exactly. Some were forced to conform to masculine norms, while others faced exile or persecution.
That's heartbreaking. It's a reminder that even in societies where gender diversity was once acknowledged, things can change, and those changes aren't always for the better.
Unfortunately, that's true.
So what became of the Mukhan-nathun?
Sadly, they eventually vanished from historical records.
It's a loss not just for the community itself, but for our understanding of the rich diversity of gender expression that existed throughout history.
It's a reminder of how important it is to document and preserve these stories before they're lost forever.
Absolutely. We need to learn from the past and honor those who came before us.
Exactly. And speaking of honoring the past, there's another group in the Middle East that has managed to persist even to this day.
Oh, really? Who are they?
The Xanith of Oman.
Okay, tell me more.
They occupy this fluid space between male and female with their own unique dress codes, social customs, and even a distinct language.
Wow, so they've managed to hold on to their traditions and identity despite all the pressures to conform?
They have. It's really remarkable.
But you said earlier that their acceptance comes with conditions. What did you mean by that?
Their situation is complex. While they're recognized within Omani society, they must adhere to certain cultural expectations. They can't overtly challenge traditional gender norms or push the boundaries too far.
So it's like a fragile acceptance, constantly at risk of being revoked if they step out of line.
Exactly. And modern influences, particularly the rise of conservative religious views, are putting even more pressure on the Xanith.
So they're caught between tradition and modernity.
Precisely. They're navigating a very delicate balance.
It highlights the ongoing challenges faced by non-binary individuals in many parts of the world, even in places where their presence has been historically acknowledged.
It's a constant struggle for visibility, acceptance, and the right to simply exist as they are.
It's a powerful reminder that the journey towards full equality is far from over.
It's a journey that requires constant vigilance and advocacy.
But I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. There must be more to discover, right?
Oh, absolutely. We've barely touched upon Europe and Africa, and trust me, there are some surprising revelations waiting for us there. Get ready to have your assumptions about history and gender challenged once again.
Okay. We're back for our final deep dive into the history of non-binary gender recognition, and I'm ready for more. I feel like we've already learned so much.
Yeah, we've barely scratched the surface. There are so many more fascinating stories to uncover.
Okay, so where are we headed next on our global exploration?
Let's travel back in time all the way to ancient Rome.
Ancient Rome. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Have you ever heard of the Galli priests?
The galley priests. The name rings a bell, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory.
They were devoted to the worship of Cybele, a powerful Phrygian mother goddess. But here's the thing that might surprise you. These priests were assigned male at birth, but embraced a female or androgynous existence.
Wait, really? I thought Roman society was all about those strict patriarchal gender roles.
It's one of those historical details that challenges our assumptions, right?
It totally does. So
Yeah.
tell me more about the galley priests. Like, what was their role in Roman society?
They were integral to the worship of Cybele. They performed elaborate rituals, often involving music, dance, and even self-mutilation.
Self-mutilation. Whoa, that's intense.
It was a way for them to connect with the goddess and transcend their physical bodies.
Okay, so their gender identity was tied to their spiritual practice.
Exactly, and their presence in Roman society wasn't always smooth sailing. Some revered them for their spiritual role, while others viewed them with suspicion or even fear.
That makes sense. Like, even today, people who challenge gender norms often face a mixed bag of reactions.
It's a reminder that these aren't just modern issues. The struggle for acceptance and understanding has been going on for centuries.
It definitely has. Okay, so we've got ancient Rome. What about Africa? What can you tell us about non-binary identities in pre-colonial African cultures?
Let's focus on the Igbo and Yoruba cultures of West Africa.
Okay, those are two cultures I'm not very familiar with, so I'm eager to learn.
They both had fascinating ways of understanding gender that went beyond a simple male-female binary.
Okay, give me an example.
The Igbo people had the concept of female husbands.
Female husbands.
Yeah. Imagine a woman, often wealthy and influential, marrying other women and taking on the social and economic responsibilities typically associated with men.
So it wasn't about romantic relationships, but about fulfilling certain societal roles.
Precisely, it was often used to preserve lineage when a family lacked male heirs.
That's really interesting. It's like a social adaptation to ensure family continuity.
Exactly. And it shows how flexible gender roles could be in these societies.
Did they have something similar for women taking on male roles?
They did. They had the concept of male daughters.
Male daughters. Okay, I'm following.
So if a family didn't have sons, they could designate a daughter as a male daughter. This allowed her to inherit property, participate in traditionally male activities, and even take on a wife.
Wow, so they really had systems in place to make sure that families and communities could thrive regardless of the gender of their members.
It's a testament to their adaptability and their understanding that gender isn't always about biology, it's about social function and the needs of the community.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
What about the Yoruba people? Did they have similar traditions?
While not identical, the Yoruba also had a very flexible understanding of gender. This was particularly evident in their religious beliefs.
Okay, so gender fluidity was woven into their spiritual practices.
Exactly. Some of their deities were considered androgynous, embodying both male and female qualities. And certain priesthoods were open to individuals regardless of their assigned sex at birth.
It's amazing to see how these cultures incorporated gender diversity into their belief systems and social structures. It really makes you question that whole notion that the gender binary is somehow natural or universal.
It does. It makes you realize that our modern Western obsession with the binary is just one way of looking at gender, and it's not even the most common way throughout history.
It definitely puts things into perspective. But sadly, I have a feeling that these traditions didn't fare well when faced with European colonialism.
You're right. As we've seen time and time again, European colonialism had a devastating impact on non-binary gender identities around the world.
Yeah.
The Igbo and Yoruba cultures were no exception.
It's like a recurring theme throughout history. These powerful forces trying to impose their own limited worldview on everyone else.
It's a story of cultural imperialism and the suppression of diversity.
So what were some of the ways that colonialism disrupted these African societies?
Well, the imposition of European legal systems, the influence of Christian missionaries, and economic marginalization all played a role in enforcing the gender binary and erasing those diverse ways of understanding gender that had existed for centuries.
It's a tragic loss. But despite these efforts to suppress these identities, we're seeing a resurgence of interest in and recognition of non-binary gender in many parts of the world.
Absolutely. There's a growing movement to reclaim and celebrate those traditions that were almost lost.
Like, what are some examples of that?
Well, we talked about the Hijra community in South Asia gaining legal recognition. There's also a revitalization of two-spirit traditions happening in North America, and there's growing awareness of pre-colonial gender fluidity in Africa.
It's like a global awakening, a recognition that gender is more complex than we've been led to believe.
It is, and it's a really hopeful sign. It shows that people are starting to question those rigid norms and embrace a more inclusive understanding of gender.
It gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, we're moving towards a future where everyone can live authentically, regardless of their gender identity.
Yeah. That's the goal we should all be striving for, a world where everyone feels safe and celebrated for who they are.
I love that. So what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to remember that gender diversity isn't a modern invention. It's not a fad or a Western import. It's a fundamental aspect of the human experience that has been recognized and celebrated in cultures around the world for centuries.
We've just forgotten or been taught to ignore this rich history.
Exactly. And by rediscovering this history, we can challenge our own assumptions and create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
So well said. This deep dive has been an incredible journey. We've traveled through time and across continents, uncovering these hidden histories and broadening our understanding of gender. I hope it's inspired our listeners to keep learning and to keep challenging those limiting beliefs.
Me too. The more we learn about the past, the better equipped we are to create a more inclusive and accepting future.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this incredible exploration of the history of non-binary gender recognition. And remember, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep those minds open.